Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Season 8 is all about the re-enchanting Inklings. How do we rebuild, renew, and restore culture? The Inklings give us a model. I want to ask for your help in two ways. You're probably watching this episode on X or on YouTube. Please find and follow us on both platforms. I tweet as at the Optimistic C3. And then if you're looking for the show on YouTube, just search for the Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want you to be able to find and follow our content and then be able to share that across your platforms. We want to be part of the conversation and help other people to see how life is truly good, true, and beautiful. And now, on to this week's episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Holly Ordway. Holly Ordway is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute and visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts and is a subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies. She's the author of the award-winning Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, and her book, Tolkien's Faith, A Spiritual Biography, was released in 2023, just in time for the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. Dr. Ordway, it's great to see you again. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
I know we had the pleasure of meeting in person at the Undiscovered Lewis Conference back in September, and I really enjoyed reading your essay in Life on the Silent Planet. So I'm really excited to get into it today.
Excellent. Well, I even have a copy of the book, so if people are wondering, what you're talking about, here we go.
Yes. I'm so glad you've got a physical copy. I have to confess, I somehow between the semester ending last week and recording this week, I have misplaced my copy. So yesterday I purchased the Kindle edition so that I could refresh my knowledge of your essay. But I'm glad you had that for the placement there. Before we get there, you have been traveling all over the place, and I love seeing your updates about going to conferences. I think you were in Oxford not too long ago, if I remember correctly, and you've got another conference coming up in Paris. Tell us a little bit about the exciting life of a Tolkien scholar.
Well, I do a fair bit of travel, and it's really marvelous because it means that people want to hear me talk about Tolkien, and so they invite me to come speak, and then if we can work it out, I go and I speak. And I do have my regular visit to Oxford twice a year. And so I had the occasion to speak to the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society and to the Newman Society there, which was great. Then I spoke in Houston and then also in Massachusetts. It's been a very busy spring. But then, yes, coming up, I'm going to Paris next month to speak at a conference called in English, the Christian Consonances of Middle Earth. It's being held at the Collège des Bernardines in conjunction with the Aubusson Weaves Tolkien exhibitions, where they have these world-class weavers who hand weave beautiful tapestries, and they're making these tapestries of Tolkien images, of his art. And so Aubusson Tees Tolkien, and so that's an ongoing exhibition. And so this conference on the Christian consonances of Middle Earth is being held May 16th through 18th. So if anybody wants to go to Paris, that's the thing you can do. I think there's about a dozen keynotes or a dozen speakers throughout the 3 days. It's going to be pretty fantastic. And I am speaking on some of the Catholic themes in Tolkien's poetry, because the collected poems just came out in November, and there's some poems there that have most of those poems never been seen before. And so it's very exciting to talk about some of the Christian themes in that. But I will say also that if you want to see me speak but can't get over to Paris, the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis Conference now has a YouTube channel, which they just launched. So if you go to YouTube, and they're putting the keynotes from last September's conference up, and mine is the first one that has gone up. So if you go over to the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis YouTube channel, there you can hear me speak on what did Tolkien really think about Narnia. So give that a little plug.
I'm sure you hear this all the time, but your lecture changed the way I thought about the relationship between Lewis and Tolkien. And now whenever I run into one of two things, I feel compelled to actually correct people. I don't do that a lot. I usually let some things slide and tend to think, okay, time, will help my students more than most things. But now when I see students cite Humphrey Carpenter, I have a sort of a visceral reaction. Like, nope, 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 probably not.
Well,
Good biographer.
Well, just to be clear, Carpenter is not without merit. There's a lot of useful information in there, but, and this is one that I talk about in this talk, he mixes in quite a lot of interpretation and speculation. So his biographies are still extremely valuable and necessary, and I draw on them in my work. But you've just got to be really on the lookout to distinguish biographical data, actual quoted things. What's the context? What's the date? What's the source? Carpenter is often quite unclear about these things versus his own interpretation presented as if it were fact. So I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Sure.
Yes, caution is important.
Oh, that's a good word. The other piece, of course, though, is this is the part that came up just a couple weeks ago. I had a student who just asserted, well, of course, Tolkien hated Narnia. And I was like, stop. I heard the definitive lecture on this very topic. And so to everybody watching this one, when you're done watching our current conversation, you've got to go check out Dr. Ordway's excellent lecture. It was, I believe it was the only standing ovation. I might not be wrong about that, but it definitely received a huge standing ovation, a very enthusiastic applause from a room full of Lewis and Tolkien fans. And many very established Lewis scholars in the room were thoroughly impressed at your work in that lecture.
I was very pleased with the reception. And I think a really important point, it sets the record straight. And also, that talk, it was packed as it was, but they are producing a special issue of Zenzuk, the C.S. Lewis journal, which is going to have several of the keynote lectures in essay form. And of course, doing it in essay form, one has the opportunity to expand. And so I've developed that lecture considerably, added more detail, added more references, strengthens my case. And also Dr. Michael Ward, who did a fantastic talk on the origins of the name Narnia and why this actually is really important and significant. Fantastic lecture. And he's got a fuller version of that, which I had the pleasure to read in, before he sent it in. Mm-hmm. And it's fantastic. So your readers, keep an eye out for the upcoming special edition of the Zenzuk C.S. Lewis journal. And if I may put in a plug, I do have a Substack newsletter now. I mean, apparently all the cool kids do. I don't know if I'm a cool kid, but I've got a Substack. So if you go, and that's where I'm actually putting out things like this new video, this issue. So if you want to keep up to date with the sorts of things I'm doing, just hop over, and it's a free subscription to my Substack newsletter. And you can get there by going to my website, hollyordway.com, or just straight to Substack.
Perfect. We'll be sure to come back to that towards the end of our conversation today. But today we're going in a slightly different direction, because normally I think of you as a Tolkien scholar, and I know that's certainly true and well-deserved. But in the essay we're discussing today, you're broadening a little bit, and I've got to reframe my mental classification of more of an Inklings scholar. I want to set this up just a little bit, because I did not know that there was such a varied world of Arthurian legend until I took a class at Faulkner University in Arthuriana, where we read from this book, The Romance of Arthur. It's an anthology of, well, we call it primary sources. I mean, they're not really historical sources, obviously, but it's a collection of different Arthurian texts. And you interact with that tradition quite a bit in your essay. And there is a lengthy tradition of working through what is often called the Matter of Britain. And it becomes one of those bodies of legends that each author is kind of taking, is curating, is editing, and using to some degree for his own purposes. And today, so I'm really excited to get into our discussion about Arthurian legend and C.S. Lewis. But before we even get there, walk us through the story of how did you end up in this collection? How did you get picked to submit something about the Ransom Trilogy?
Well, I mean, I am primarily a Tolkienist, but I do work in Inkling studies more broadly speaking. I'm actually the Charles Williams subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies, and I've written various chapters on Lewis specifically for different books over the years. And one of those, which caught the eye of Rislaverty, the editor, I contributed a chapter on the medieval sources for the Inklings for a volume called The Inklings and King Arthur, edited by Serena Higgins, which came out a few years ago. And that one I laid out, just what the title says, these are the sources that I used. It was just a sort of descriptive statement, descriptive piece. And so Rislaverty read that and said, okay, I think I'd like to have her write about she clearly knows the material, the Arthurian material. Let's have her write about That Hideous Strength. And so that was the immediate, reason that I did that piece. But I actually been interested in Arthuriana for decades. It was an area that I worked on for my PhD work. So that's 25 years ago now. Did a fair bit of work reading the original sources, and the primary sources. It is correct to say primary sources, because they're and then just being interested in it. And so I know more than the average bear about the matter of Britain, and specifically about the great diversity of the Arthurian tradition. And that was one of the things that really interested me when I dug into writing this. It was really an interesting piece to write. And I went into it not knowing what my thesis was going to be. There are different ways to approach writing a piece. You can be already familiar with the material, and you've discerned, okay, this is an argument that I'm going to make, and then you make it. But this was a case where I knew I had this material, but I did not yet know what I was going to say about it. So I just got stuck into it, started making some notes, looked at, well, what's Lewis doing? Oh, he's doing that. Oh, he's doing that. How interesting. And then from that was able to discover some really interesting things, I think. But the starting point was really recognizing, first, the diversity of the Arthurian traditions, and second, this is not a surprise, Lewis's absolute mastery of that. And for the average reader today, most people don't know about this diversity of traditions. You think, okay, King Arthur. Well, there's Arthur, King Arthur. Depending how well versed you are, there's the Sword and the Stone. There's Merlin. There's Lancelot and Guinevere having an affair. And there you go. Well, that's a kind of modern capsule version, but there's lots of things that come in and out. I mean, it's mind-boggling how self-contradictory the legendarium is, because in some stories Mordred is not there. Some stories he's Arthur's nephew. Sometimes he's his illegitimate son. Sometimes he's just a random guy who did no harm. Lancelot is invented by the French. In some of the earliest ones, Guinevere has an affair with Mordred.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah. So, and then of course Arthur himself varies a great deal. He's a warlord, or he's the chivalric hero. In some of the earlier versions, he's quite warlike. He goes off and he conquers Rome. Okay, that's a different version of the story. And some are more supernatural and some are less. Merlin appears in some, but not in others. So it's extremely, extremely varied.
Just to give a bit of a quick illustration, because I'm recording at Thales College today. I have some of my Arthurian books are here and some are at home, but Cambridge University put together a guide to of academic articles on this. But here, of course, is 20th century T.H. White, and this is the version that you mentioned a moment ago as far as the Sword and the Stone. That's where this comes from, before Disney. No,
the Sword and the Stone is ancient. That's actually
I stand corrected.
Yeah, but you're right that T.H. White really has presented the kind of, he kind of set the template for kind of the 20th century versions. But yeah, the Sword and the Stone is older. But how it's used, how it's presented, it appears in some, it doesn't appear in others. It's varied.
At least it's been way too long since I've read T.H. White. My sense is that the Disney movie version draws very heavily on T.H. White, but I'd have to go back and watch that to really be able to prove that.
No, it is, especially because what White does is he invents a childhood for Arthur that's much more elaborate. than what we have in the stories. I mean, the stories are really not that interested in Arthur's boyhood. Okay, there he is, and then okay, now he's king. And of course, the whole aspect of Merlin teaching the young Arthur is invented by White. It's a great invention. It's brilliant, narratively speaking. The sword and the stone part of that, of Once You Be King, is, I think, really the strongest bit. But it's a new sort of interpretation of it, which is what I mean. A legendarium like this, it's so fluid that it opens up the possibility for lots of authors to work with it in lots of different ways. It's kind of shocking. There is no one set Arthurian story. There's certain key kind of touch points. Yep. But there's a lot of fluidity and a lot of room for people to come in and invent and adapt. And that's always been the case. So what White is doing with inventing, Merlin tutoring Arthur is really equivalent to, the medieval French poet Chrétien de Troyes, who takes the English, the British legends, British and Welsh legends, and then invents a whole bunch of characters. He invents Percival. He invents Lancelot. He basically brings in the whole courtly love tradition and writes all these stories that have, it's like Arthurian fan fiction, essentially, and then it becomes part, in turn, of the overall legendarium.
Well, and then you've got, of course, the original British guy, Geoffrey of Monmouth. He may not be the real OG for this, but he's so much fun. I love teaching this one in medieval history classes, because he just defies any of our disciplinary divisions. Is it history? Is it literature? Is it myth? Monmouth just says yes to all of it. And of course, what would a conversation be without bringing Tolkien in? I mean, he did his version of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and the Green Knight. He also had the death of Arthur, if I remember correctly. That came out a couple years ago.
Let's make sure we're precise, because Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is Tolkien's translating. So he's doing a strict translation of the medieval poem. It's in Middle English, and Tolkien's translation is fantastic. It's really, really, really well done. And he's also written some essays on Sir Gawain. It's a beautiful translation, but it's a translation. And then The Fall of Arthur was his attempt at his own engagement with the legend. Mm-hmm. So here he's now operating creatively. He's telling his own version. And it's interesting because he's telling using some of the later characters and themes, but he's choosing to write it in alliterative verse, which is the Old English tradition. But he's not writing Old English, he's writing in modern English using the alliterative verse tradition of Old English. So it's a real intersection of some different themes and literary motifs. And it's really good. Unfortunately, he didn't finish it, as is so often the case.
Well, my personal vision of eternity is, for when I was a child, was basically heaven was a library where you could sit forever and read all the books that authors didn't have time to finish during life. And so maybe Tolkien is just finishing them all in eternity.
Well, I look forward to that. All being well, we'll all end up there and we can sit around their feet and say, okay, let's have a story now. That'll be great.
It will be. Well, let's get into Lewis, in particular your essay, Arthur in Edgestow. Now, Lewis does so much in That Hideous Strength, and I've already talked with Dr. Ward about this one. With Reese and I had a great conversation, and Christiana Hale came on to talk about her contribution. But none of our conversations, for all that we romped through themes of contraception, technology, modernism, science, government, politics, philosophy, education, Arthur did not come up in any of those. And that's the province of your essay. So where does Arthurian legend show up in That Hideous Strength?
Well, it's interesting because once you see it everywhere in the book, but it's slightly hidden. And Lewis is so clever about this. There's three real tip-off points. One is the titles of Ransom. So we have Elwyn Ransom, the protagonist of Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra. We've met him as this, middle-aged academic on a walking tour, and then he gets sent to Venus. Okay. And then we meet him in That Hideous Strength, and he's different, and he's weirdly younger and wounded. But most notably, he has 2 new titles. He is he's now Mr. Fisher King. Okay. And he is the Pendragon. Now, both of those are titles that are taken straight out of the Arthurian legendarium, although interestingly, Lewis in both cases repurposes them, does some interesting things with them. Then a third element is the most obvious is Merlin. Merlin's a character, the actual Merlin of the legendarium. And a fourth thing is the mention of Logres as the sort of Arthur's kingdom. And also, so fifth thing, Arthur himself gets a mention a couple different times, although Arthur does not feature as a character. He is off in Paralandra, the equivalent of Avalon. So there are these, 5 sort of touch points about Arthurian elements. Now, you might think, they're just a little bit of window dressing. He's just, putting in some stuff to be cool. Lewis never does anything by randomly. He has the marvelously complex mind. Things have a purpose. And as I looked more deeply at these things, they do come together, and they allow him to connect what's going on in That Hideous Strength to what it means to be someone in Britain, to national identity and culture, and also what it just means to be a Christian, living out the Christian life. So there's a lot of sort of interesting touch points there.
And one of the things that struck me, this was probably 2 times ago reading The Hideous Strength, was the way Ransom and the community at St. Anne's parallels the Arthurian community, because in each of the different versions of Arthur, he's more active in some and he's more passive in others, but he always gathers an assembly around him, and that assembly becomes very significant in the overall story, but the community never lasts. And so I just I think that's maybe one other piece I'd add to your list of like that made just that community around the Fisher King is not by himself. He's not. Instead, Mr. Fisher King, the Pendragon, is building the community at St. Anne's, and he's got knights and ladies around him, even if they don't use quite the formal language. McPhee is not quite Sir Kay, I suppose, but there's still there's that parallel that I just find so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't mention it because I think it's a loose parallel, and I think it's important not to push it too far, because there are not any direct correspondences other than Ransom is an Arthurian figure. He's sort of an Arthur figure at various points, but only partly. I mean, he's the Pendragon, but he's not Arthur. He's in the lineage of Arthur in a sense. That's one thing that Lewis does that's different. But the other characters don't peg on. There's no Lancelot equivalent. There's no Percival equivalent. And so this is a little note of caution, like that element of a fellowship, yes, but it partakes of other forms of fellowship as well.
Sure. Well, I did, as I was reading your essay, I was struck by one section where you focused on the claim that this is Lewis's most Charles Williams influenced novel. And one last photo placement. I grabbed my copy of Williams' edition of Arthurian Poetry, edited by Serena Higgins. But so clearly Williams had a big interest in Arthur, and Lewis and Williams were close friends. Is that assertion correct? Are people right to see a lot of Charles Williams in That Hideous Strength?
That's a very interesting question. Because the answer is yes and no. And I came a little bit more firmly on the no side in my essay because people have over asserted this connection. And I think to the detriment of their understanding of what Lewis is doing. So first, to set the context a little bit. So Lewis was a great admirer of Williams's work, including in a rare lapse of literary judgment, Williams's poetry. And he he's very interested in this. They were good friends for several years. During the Second World War, Williams came to Oxford. OUP, Oxford University Press, evacuated the staff from London to Oxford. So Williams, who worked for OUP, was actually in Oxford attending Inklings meetings. So they got to know each other quite well in person. And then Williams died right at the end of the war, quite unexpectedly. So they had a strong, close friendship for those years. And of course, it's in that time period that Lewis writes That Hideous Strength. There are definitely some themes and approaches in That Hideous Strength that are very similar to what Williams is doing in his spiritual thrillers. So the kind of flavor of That Hideous Strength, with its sort of intersection of the mundane and the spiritual, definitely has a resemblance to what Williams is doing in books like, even War in Heaven has the Holy Grail. So there's an Arthurian element there. And they both had this great interest in Arthuriana. We said there's War in Heaven, Williams's sort of Arthurian story. So there's a lot of parallels, and it's quite correct to note those parallels. The question is, are those parallels influences? And I think the evidence is not nearly as much as people think. One of the things is that both of them are interested in Arthuriana, but Lewis's interest in Arthurian literature long predates his reading anything by Williams. Indeed, some of the very themes that Williams himself also works with, we have evidence of Lewis already working with before he even meets Williams. So this, and also Lewis even admitted himself that Williams was not a real scholar. He's not an academic. So not an insult, it's just a statement of fact. Lewis was a real academic who could read the primary sources. Williams was a self-taught amateur who was interested in these things, who couldn't read the original sources, couldn't grapple with the text in the way that Lewis did, simply didn't know the material as well as Lewis did by a long shot. So I think recognizing that, a lot of what looks like influence of Williams to Lewis is actually purely coincidental. It's Lewis is working with material that had interested him since boyhood and that he knew professionally very well, was already working with imaginatively in various drafts and poems. And here's Williams, who also likes this stuff. How cool, right? And probably that helped them get interested in each other. Like, he also likes this stuff, but it's not a matter of influence. And then in terms of the style, could Williams's approach in the spiritual thrillers have influenced Lewis to write in the way that he did in That Hideous Strength? Possibly. But Lewis could also have approached it that way because that was the natural way to engage with his material. There's no direct evidence that it was Williams who put him on that path. Is it similar to what Williams is doing? In some ways, yes. Is that influence? Possibly it's a contributing factor. But I say all these very sort of cautionary things because people have just jumped to the conclusion that, as Roger Lancelyn Green and Walter Hooper say this in their biography of Lewis, many people have called That Hideous Strength a C.S. Lewis book by Charles Williams. And they say, that's the thing. And they ignore the fact that Green and Hooper go on in the very next sentence to say, but that is a wild exaggeration. And I think it's worth dwelling on because when people make this too quick assumption of Williams influenced Lewis, and therefore that's why we have it this way, they sort of disregard to a certain extent what Lewis is doing, partly because, frankly, Williams is the inferior writer by quite a lot. And so I think it has an influence. So people don't then ask, well, what is Lewis doing with these things? They say, he's being Charles Williamsy, and then they move on. And that really does not do justice to what Lewis is doing. And indeed, one of the things I found when I was teasing out the themes, what Lewis is doing with some of the themes, actually the Logris, he's actually presenting an approach that's completely at odds with Williams's own approach.
Let me read that passage in particular, because I was very intrigued by that. This is from page 244 of Life on the Silent Planet. And it's, I'm just going to read a little bit towards just before we get the Merlin section. This is, you're referencing here a conversation with Professor Dimble. However, Dimble goes on to say that the healing of the world entails nurturing the individual and distinct goodness of each person, and indeed each nation. When, quote, when Logris really dominates Britain, when the goddess reason, the divine clearness is really enthroned in France, when the order of heaven is really followed in China, why then it will be spring, end quote. Lewis's Logris then offers a distinct affirmation of goodness expressed in the particular unrepeatable instances of different nations and different individuals. How is what Lewis is doing different than what Williams is doing with Logris? They both love the term. They both like the idea.
Yeah, and the term is not invented by either of them. It's a medieval term, and for hundreds of years, many different writers had used the term Logris as that kind of liminal space, that sort of weird boundary. Is it a spiritual realm? Is it a physical realm? Is it political? What is it? It's a space where anything can happen. And so, again, both Williams and Lewis are independently working with an older existing tradition that had already been brought up in other poems like Milton, whom Williams knew as well as Lewis. So they're independently working with this idea of the kingdom of Arthur having some sort of strange status of neither one thing nor the other. Now, what Williams does, Williams loves the idea of empire. And he conceives of this sort of Byzantium becomes this sort of the overall empire. And he maps it onto the human body. One of the weirdest things about Williams is he maps his kingdom literally onto the human body. He drew a map in which a woman's naked form is traced over Europe. Her bum is on, the Caucasus. Yeah, it's not reprinted in every edition of his poetry. I wonder why. It's so peculiar. So he has this idea of the empire in a sort of mystical way. And his view of Logris is that Britain becomes Logris, becomes a supernatural Britain, insofar as it's assimilated into the empire.
Okay.
Assimilated into it is really key. And for Williams, his idea of empire is all about order. He was fascinated by order, by geometry. These images come up again and again in his poetry. And Tolkien, for instance, really he cottons onto this and he dislikes it. He sees a kind of oppressive authoritarianism in Williams's view of Byzantium. And so for Williams, the idea of Britain as Logris is to assimilate it into the empire, and then it becomes one part in the whole. But Lewis, on the other hand, as in the passage you just read, is seeing that every country has its own kind of guiding spirit, literally in the Ransom Trilogy, the Oyarsa of a particular country. And it has a particular characteristic which is different, with a different kind of goodness. I mean, it's all fundamentally good. There is the moral order, the Tao, which, he explores an abolition of man, which is, That Hideous Strength is really a literary outworking of the abolition of man. So there's the underlying moral order, which is the same universally, but the individual expression of it, just as human beings are distinct, Lewis is envisioning that every nation has its own character. So, for instance, in France, the divine reason, and in England, it's the sort of the spirit of Logris, and that's so different from Williams, because it's about the goodness of the distinctive qualities of these different nations, and explicitly says there is no emperor. He's out with the idea of empire.
Merlin's upset about that. Merlin's ready to he thinks, let's go implore the emperor to get rid of the NICE. That'll solve. And that's Merlin's got to get a little up to speed, I suppose, in that moment.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we have to remember, I mean, obviously in history, we now have no universal emperor, but remember that Lewis, in his imaginative framework, could have had a sort of spiritual emperor, just as Ransom is the Pendragon. He could have imaginatively said, yes, there is a spiritual emperor and we will find him. But he doesn't. He doesn't. There's no emperor. There is, they have to be local. They're very local, respecting the universal in terms of the moral law, but operating locally, incarnationally. And that's just so not Williams. And of course, the very chaos of St. Anne's with the vegetable garden sprawling all over the place and the bear wandering around and there's no plan. I mean, that's just so not Charles Williams' geometrical order. He would have lost his mind.
I think I would enjoy wandering through Lewis's garden more than I would roaming through Williams' precise geometrically shaped bushes. But as you were describing that, it reminds me of the end of The Last Battle, where at the very end, Lucy is standing there with Mr. Tumnus, and he directs her to look across the mountain range, and there she sees the England that is within England, and her parents are there, and there's a line about all the countries, all the real countries, possibly implying that maybe there are some countries that aren't quite real, but all the real countries have their ultimate reality in Aslan's country. But my friend Daniel Pitt would if he were listening to this, he would definitely chime in that this is something both Roger Scruton and Russell Kirk, both drawing from Edmund Burke, would assert is really core to the conservative tradition, that there is not a universal legal practice. There instead are nations, and each nation is working out its own customs as those have developed over time. And Lewis seems, and to this extent, seems to be in that same tradition of thought, that he's not looking for global Rome. He wants Britain to be its most Britishness, or its most, which he defines as logos, but it's like the most English that the English can be is ultimately for their good.
Yeah, but again, with the underlying adherence to the moral law. So this is not relativism, and this is not just pure untrammeled individualism, because that expression of pure Englishness or Frenchness or Chineseness is only possible insofar as it's in accord with the fundamental moral law. Because there certainly can be, and alas are, countries that are having an outpouring of their practice in ways that are in serious violation of the moral law. And Lewis would have no trouble with that, I think.
No, I think that's right. Now, over on page 239, you tell us that Lewis is able to have his cake and eat it too when it comes to working Arthurian legend into his story. What choices is he making about? You've already told us about these different touch points, and hopefully our audience has gotten a sense of the variety and diversity within this legendarium. But what choices is Lewis making then about how he's going to incorporate these figures into his story?
Well, I think here we come back to the fact that there are really two very distinct elements in the Arthurian legendarium. There's the British Welsh core, which is sort of the more historic. It's the area that has the more historic grounding. It's more martial. There's more about the battles fighting off the invading Saxons. Very not much by way of magic. Some and there's no courtly love element. And then we have the later French tradition, Crétin de Troyes, the Vulgate cycle, and there we get courtly love. We get Lancelot's invented, and then we get the whole Grail cycle. The whole Grail cycle is later and separate from the first British Welsh core. So usually when someone's working with the Arthurian materials, they've got to make a choice. A lot of modern authors have chosen to, like Mary Stewart, have chosen to work primarily with the historical setting and limiting themselves to what was plausible in,
Mm-hmm.
those early centuries. Others, like T.H. White, have just said, okay, we're going to take the development of the legendarium, we're just going to run with that. But then if you do that, you have a very different setting. The court of Camelot does not fit in the world of Geoffrey and Monmouth. The two things don't go together. And then there's Merlin. What do you do with Merlin? So what Lewis is doing is it's such a clever literary move. He has, in the voice of Dimble, he identifies the two strands, so the British Welsh and the later sort of French, and he says, "Oh, this is a spiritual. This is Logres in Britain." And so then he's able to connect to the original British Welsh context, and that's the historical context he puts Merlin in. But he's also able to then tap into the imagery and the symbolism and the references to the Grail, to the Pendragon. I mean, the Pendragon is actually from the British Welsh sources, but it's only applies to Arthur's father, not to Arthur. It's not until the 19th century with Tennyson and the Idylls of the King that we get it applied to Arthur. And then this idea of the Fisher King, that's a French invention. The idea of the whole Grail story, totally not part of the original British Welsh. So he's able to ground it in the historical setting and give Merlin, make a really interesting. I mean, he makes Merlin a druid, basically a Christian druid, right on that liminal moment when Britain is relatively new as a Christian country. He can very realistically make Merlin Celtic, part of that tradition, heir to the druidic wisdom, still kind of in touch with forces that would later become not lawful, but were still more or less lawful then, kind of. So he's able to use that historical setting, which is so powerful for the character of Merlin, and gives that lengthy historical connection, and allows him to ground the Arthurian story in Britain. Because once you get to Lancelot, Guinevere, all of that stuff, the story kind of detaches slightly from Britain as the soil that we live in. It becomes a kind of, I mean, yeah, it's Britain, but you can't really picture it. It's not a historical England. It's a sort of alternate Arthurian England. But Lewis is able to keep the real historical grounding and also bring in all of the really rich thematic elements that come in the later medieval developments. So that's why I say that he's able to have his cake and eat it too.
Well, and Merlin serves such an important role. I mean, that lets Lewis and, in the story, Ransom and company kind of get out of a theological conundrum. Because it's Lewis gives, I'm not going to be able to quote it from memory, but Lewis gives one of my favorite passages in That Hideous Strength, as Dimble and Ransom are talking about Merlin in particular. And he talks about the fact that over time, things that were permissible earlier in time get limited. And so the further you are in time, the more choices have been made and things have now been forbidden. But earlier in a moment, they had not yet been forbidden. So since he's coming from that earlier day, Merlin can be in touch with spirits that if Ransom were to try and summon the spirits of the earth and the river and the trees, which Merlin's ready to invoke as soon as he wakes up, that it would really be an act of animism or some sort of weird pantheism. It would be something wrong for Ransom to do.
And it's interesting because it still is, because you will note that Merlin offers to do this and Ransom says no. Right. He says no. So it's not so much what Merlin can do, but rather who he is. Because Ransom is clear, like, no, it would not any longer be lawful to tap into those forces, although it was in those days. What's key is that Merlin has the ability to be open to those kinds of forces in a way that no one in Ransom's own time can be. And that's what enables him to receive the powers, the planetary powers, which come down to shatter the NICE and destroy the Hideous Strength.
Yeah, because I suppose if that were to happen to a modern person, I forget if it's Ransom or Dimble, somebody talks about if this happened to somebody today, we would call this possession. And yet Merlin has already, whatever price was paid for him to be open spiritually in this way, he's already paid that price, and there's no going back.
Yeah,
So
and
he's a tool that can be used in that way.
exactly. And so there's a kind of a providence in it that he alone, because what was lawful then but is no longer now, lawfully shaped him into the kind of tool who can take in the powers now and not be destroyed by it, and bring them to Bellbury, where they will do their work. And it really, I mean, it's self-sacrificial, because although we're not told what happens to Merlin, it's quite strongly implied that it results in his death. We see that last scene of him going away, and there is, I think, the implication that he has laid down his life for his friends, and that he has been shattered by it. And it's pretty powerful.
And at the same time, I mean, Merlin he's this bizarre. I love how Lewis gives us this snapshot of sort of a civilized barbarian in a way, because he clearly has a civilized, I think he's called urbane at one point, but he also has a strength and a vigor and just an ironclad, inflexible, this is the way it is and ought to be. That's about his character that comes out in some really interesting conversations.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to cut Jane's head off when he sees her, which is, that's a dramatic response. And this actually, we don't have time to go into this fully, but this connects up to your conversation with Michael Ward about contraception and matrimony, because Merlin is one of the figures by which Lewis is thematically kind of presenting that theme, because there's that whole theme of matrimony that Michael unpacks in his essay, but Merlin calls our attention to that, because he says, why does he want to cut Jane's head off? He says, she is the falsest of any woman here alive. And that, to anybody who's alert to the Arthurian resonances, will make us think Guinevere is false. She commits adultery, and she brings down the Round Table because of it. She destroys Camelot because of that, her and Lancelot. And then Ransom says, no, is it Ransom or Dimble? Anyway, says, no, she's chaste. Dimble says she's chaste. She's faithful to her husband. And then Merlin says, yeah, but by their own will, they are barren. They're contracepting in their marriage. And that's what makes her false, because she has closed off the self-giving. They have both closed off the self-giving elements in their marriage. And that, we are told explicitly, they're supposed to conceive the next Pendragon. But because of this sort of inwardness, this being closed off to life, they're choosing voluntary sterility, which is the besetting sin of the NICE folks who are afraid of life. They're afraid of fertility. You've got Philostrato, who wants to have artificial trees and artificial birds because otherwise they're so creepy and dirty. Let's just sterilize everything. Well, that's the same line of thought. And so Merlin is saying, this is a great crime. Cut off her head. And of course, Dimble's like, no, don't cut off her head. Really.
Oh, it is so. I think it's just a really interesting moment where Lewis takes this, and certainly it was Dr. Ward and I talked about this at the beginning of that episode. Contraception was wildly controversial in the early 20th century. By the early 21st century, it's just a given. It seems like what various authors have talked about our contraceptive world and so on. Katie Faust and Mary Harrington both use that phrase. But Lewis gives us this medieval prophet, priest, wizard man who has no comprehension of like modern niceties. And in that, he gives us a perfect foil for this. But I never thought about Jane as a Guinevere figure. And if you're right, like that would suggest that voluntary contraception in marriage is on par with adultery as sort of a violation of the nature of marriage. Which I've not thought about that. I don't want to necessarily like say that that's true, but I just think that's a very interesting idea to contemplate, that this could be two equally wrong ways to go about marriage. And that one, we know, well, we obviously take vows against adultery, but one I don't know that we really contemplate as like, actually, this is, and Dr. Ward talked about a lot about, I think it's matrimony as the mother-making state was his big argument. So anyway, I'll say I think that's very interesting to consider Jane as a Guinevere figure in that moment.
Yeah, because it calls to mind, what does it mean to be faithful? If we're committing, I mean, there are people who would argue, I think very, very wrongly and very dangerously, for open marriage, to say, oh, well, but if you have feelings for somebody else, then why not make a threesome? Why not make a poly, kind of mix? And that's putting a sort of emotions above, well, what's the function of what is the function of marriage? Well, if it's mother making, that really kind of tells you that's the pair, right? You just got two going on there, and that union is really important. So the idea of like, adultery is wrong because it disrupts the emotional bond of marriage. It breaks it open, it breaks it apart. And of course, with Jane and Mark, by choosing to contracept, choosing to be sterile, they think presumably that they're doing the right thing. They're maybe making their careers easier right now or what have you, but they're also withholding part of their commitment to each other. They're saying, yes, I give myself to you, but not all of me. I'm holding part of it back. No, not all of me, not now, not in that way. And that's also a kind of a denial. It's a saying yes, but no. And yeah, that's something to consider. And that, we see this relationship between Jane and Mark play out where each of them has to have that conversion moment. Because, in this scheme of things, if Jane is false, so is Mark, Merlin would have set off with his head too if he had happened.
Yes.
They both have to come to grips with this, and they both do. In that last scene.
Wow. It's one of Lewis's most masterful things, I think, the way he continues to introduce characters that we know, if we're reading carefully, and we know Lewis is a Christian, we know he's writing Christian fiction after his conversion, we know these characters are going to be redeemed, and yet the way he gets there is always so interesting. I just finished reteaching the Chronicles of Narnia this semester, and I was just kind of fascinated. The pattern had never quite leapt out to me before of Eustace the traitor needs to be redeemed. I'm sorry, Edmund the traitor, Eustace, the boy who always sees the world wrongly, needs to be redeemed. Jill Pole doesn't quite know it, and she's the least obviously needing to be redeemed character, but she also needs to be redeemed. So does Shasta and Aravis. So does Puzzle the donkey, and yet, and even so does what's his name, the Calorman at the end of the last battle. Like Lewis just keeps giving us these characters. Like, see, here's this other facet of sin that needs to be taken in and forgiven, and he shows us the amazing love of God and how it can transform all of these characters and meets them all where they're at.
And even, a character that's often totally misunderstood is Susan in the last battle, because her fault, insofar as we're shown it, is not that she likes lipstick and boys and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that. The fault is that she has turned away from Aslan, that she's always been in a hurry to grow up. She hasn't wanted to be who she is, where she is, when she is, and she is no longer a friend of Aslan. And it's not that the lipstick and the nylons are at fault. It's not her femininity. It's the fact that she has made an idol of them. And it could have been equally, I don't know, motorcycles and whatever. It wasn't. That's what he chose for her. So she's turned away from Aslan. So she needs to be redeemed. And the key thing is that he leaves it open that she can be, because she does not die at the end of the story. The rest of them do. It shocks people to think that this is not a bad thing that these characters have died, but we're all going to die. The question is, what state are we? I hope it's not a shock to anybody watching this. Are going to die. But the question, in what state will we die? And if we are ready, and the same thing in That Hideous Strength, that there's all the Edgestow is destroyed at the end, and almost everyone is evacuated through various, sometimes it's coincidence, sometimes a call from a friend, could be mystical. Some people heard their cats mysteriously telling them get out. But Lewis says that at the end, the only people who were still there were just the totally corrupt and the ones who were so pure that they were ready to go. So that's really interesting. He doesn't make it that all the innocent people leave. He makes so everybody who's not ready to die but could still be redeemed is out, but either the irredeemable, alas, or those who can receive death with joy because they're ready and they're going to go straight to heaven. Those are the folks who he allows to stay. And I think it's the same thing in the last battle with Susan. The brothers and sisters, they're ready to go. Train crash, okay, momentary pain, and then they're on.
Holidays have begun.
Exactly. But Susan is not a friend of Aslan. So what would have happened to her if she died in that state? Ooh, that's grim. So she doesn't. We don't know her story. We don't know what happens to her. So it is the opposite of saying that Susan is damned. It's the actual literal opposite of that.
Dr. Ordway, I don't know if you ever try your own hand at writing fiction, but if so, I'd love to read your version of somehow resolving the problem of Susan at the end of all things. I know the now definitively fallen from grace Neil Gaiman took his stab at at writing that. I know. I don't want to go into details there. That story just broke my heart, and I love his stories so much, and he's awful. Anyway, yes. But he wrote like the worst version of what could have happened to Susan, and we need a better version of that. I can't write fiction. I can do book reviews and occasional criticism, but I can't write fiction. If you can, you should write a story of like resolving Susan for us.
Yeah, well, I don't think I would dare step into the shoes of the master in that regard. I think the Narnia septet is good. We're gonna leave it be. But I do think it's important to underscore for readers that it really does remain an open question, and we can hope. And that's the same thing, as Christians, that we always have hope for the lost to come home.
Which is maybe a great way to wrap back around to Arthur, because the Arthurian stories all end in doom in a sense. I mean, the Arthurian community never lasts. Camelot never endures. Tennyson just has the saddest idols of like this decrepit falling city, and so too, as far as we know, the community at St. Anne's, we don't know what's going to happen to them. The next Pendragon does seem to have been conceived, but we don't know. We just don't know. So I think Lewis leaves us at that same moment of kind of, all right, this community this story is done, but there's hope for them. I want to ask one last question, and we need to wrap up for today. But we've talked about a lot of things over the last hour or so. But I want to ask this after all of the different themes and elements that we've discussed, the literary choices and the play. Why do you think Lewis reaches back to Arthur for his most anti-modernist novel? Like, there's not a clear Arthurian theme running through Out of the Silent Planet or in Paralandra. He's not quite thinking in the exact same vein when we get to Narnia. It's That Hideous Strength. He reaches back for Arthur. Why Arthurian here?
Well, that's just a really interesting question. And the basic answer is I don't know, because we don't know what his creative process was. I mean, each of the stories is distinctive, is unique. They're doing different kinds of things, but I think that one of the things he is doing in That Hideous Strength is looking at that sort of combination of what does it mean to be a moral human being? What does it mean to be a Christian? And how do I do that in community? Because we have these sort of parallel communities. We've got Belbury and NICE. We've got Bracton College. We have St. Anne's. And then we have all these characters who are trying to figure out how they relate to these different communities. And that's something that we have to navigate as as individuals, as Christians, there's a desire to be part of a community. This is a natural desire, and St. Anne's is a good community. There's also a pull towards the pleasures of being in what Lewis would call the inner ring, in a way that can be idolatrous and corrupting. And that's what Mark is drawn into and is almost destroyed by at Bellbury. And so I think one of the things he's doing with the Arthurian sort of imagery, which is, below, it's not an Arthurian story. He's using Arthurian elements in his story. I think partly he's giving a kind of deeper resonance and deeper significance to, these are just some ordinary people. There's an academic, there's, we know there's various people, McPhee, what is McPhee even doing? He's basically a gardener. You got these mismatched people. And yet they're part of something that's really cosmically significant. So they're both, but at the same time, their individual stories are not rendered less important. I mean, the marriage between Jane and Mark is really the thread that goes through the whole story. And it's not just about them conceiving the Pendragon. It's about the restoration of their relationship. They have to come, to really be properly married and to really relate with each other and reckon in the ways that they each have hindered that or, put obstacles in the way of it, especially Mark. Mark, he has a lot of grown up to do. He's really kind of a jerk. Jane may, she has her faults, and she at least accedes to this voluntary sterility, but she's much more open to God, and she's ready to do the right thing. And Mark, oh my word, Mark is a real jerk for much of the book. And he really has to come to grips. And he goes over to the side, he's aiding and abetting, he's lying, he's doing all this stuff. And yet he comes all the way back and, and is also has this relationship restored with his wife as he comes back with this humility finally. So I think the kind of echoes of Arthurian themes, I think, help us to recognize, this matters. The ordinary matters. It's not just, there's the epic and then there's little me. It's no, there's the epic and there's me doing my work. It may be in secret, in quiet, in obscurity, because no one in England has any idea that they've been saved by these people at St. Anne's, in a bear. They've no idea. And of course, and this is kind of a redeemed Camelot, because it's not a mapping onto the Arthurian story, but insofar as we have this grouping at St. Anne's, they succeed. The fellowship does not break apart, and there is no betrayal. And so they may go their own ways at some point, but it's not going to be the breaking of the fellowship as it is because the Arthurian saga it's tragic. Wow. It would be as if Mark never came back and Mark, said, no, I'm going to stay with the NICE. That would be a more sort of traditionally Arthurian thing. Or maybe he comes back and he kills Ransom, stabs him like Mordred. Oh. Yeah, that would be very Arthurian, but that's not the path that Lewis takes. So he uses these Arthurian elements to kind of bring in a gravitas and a significance, and to highlight these themes. There are things I wrote about that we haven't talked about, obviously, the spiritual inheritance. And I think there's that gravitas and rootedness that comes from the Arthurian themes. But Lewis is not simply retelling the story. He's saying it could be different. And in that sense, he's kind of opening it out and saying, well, there you go. Now go tell your own story, live your own story. And it's going to be good, right?
No, it's beautiful. I think in so many ways, this is a cosmic novel that is ultimately about a marriage. And the way you save the cosmos is not by becoming Thanos and snapping your fingers or being the Avengers. It's actually by being a faithful husband, a faithful wife, growing in your own marriage. That's how you redeem the cosmos for Lewis. At the same time, I think it's interesting, as you were describing that, you reminded me I was thinking of a section in this preface to Paradise Lost, where Lewis doesn't quite come out and directly say, here are Milton's flaws. I'm going to try to beat him. But it's just a hair's breadth short of that. Then I think if you go over to Paralandra, you see Lewis trying to say, okay, well, all right, the problem in Paradise Lost was God was boring because he talked too much and Adam was boring. Well, I'm just going to put Tor elsewhere for the whole book. That solves that problem. Also, you can't really do like unfallen and then fallen intercourse. Like that just didn't work in Paradise Lost. So let's have a naked green lady, but have it be an unerotic nudity the entire book. And so I wonder if perhaps there is if I were in your class, I suspect you would give me a look and you would probably like not accept this paper because I couldn't possibly have enough proof for you. But I wonder if there's a sense in which Lewis has a strain where he's trying to take this older story and sort of repair the story in a way. And so here we have this Arthurian-ish story with a marriage that is fixed in contrast to Camelot that is destroyed by the marriage.
Well, that I would not give you a look, except it was encouragement, because whether or not he consciously intended it, it is something that he achieved. And there's so much going on creatively, in any writer that there can be things that he is legitimately doing that he may not necessarily be fully aware of consciously as he's doing it. Now, since he is working with the Arthurian legendarium and he is choosing to make departures from it, the fact that he ends on a positive note is his intentional, literary choice. So it's significant. So I think that's, and I think it's really interesting that you bring up, the way that, Paralandra is a re-envisioning of Paradise Lost. And he knew Milton very well, as we know. So yeah, I can see him being in dialogue with Milton and saying like, yeah, let me show you how it's done. This is great. I like this.
Well, Dr. Ordway, I know we could probably go on for a long, long time, but I don't want to. We don't need to do that today. I know we both got other places to be. How can people find and follow you online?
Well, they can go over to my website, which is hollyordway.com, and that's got information about all of my books, and you can contact me through there. And there's also a link to my Substack newsletter, which is where I put it out every so often and say, here's a thing that I have done. So yeah, hollyordway.com, and that's where you find all the details.
Perfect. We'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes. I commend you for being consistent with your Substack. I jumped on the bandwagon, I think for maybe the third time. I'm going to try to actually keep this particular Substack, but my first post, I just put in a paragraph like, I am not going to maintain this with any sort of regularity. This is a place for lecture notes that I just want to get out there to the world, but haven't found a place to publish them. So if I have that sort of thing, it can go on my Substack. So like folks who can actually keep up with them, it's just so impressive. I've not found that to work. So I'm glad you do. Well, we have had a great live stream audience with us today, so I want to address those folks real quick for a moment. If you are joining in for live stream today, please know we'll have this episode out on our regular podcast channels in about 4 to 5 weeks. Should be out by the end of May. So in order to know when that's out, please do find us on X or on YouTube, and you can search for us as The Optimistic Curmudgeon on all the platforms, and you'll find us there. So thank you, Dr. Ordway, for a delightful conversation. It's always great to talk with you.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us here today on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Dr. Holly Ordway, Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute and visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please do find and follow us on X and on YouTube. On X, you can find me as @TheOptimisticC3, and on YouTube, just search for Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want to make sure that you have the ability to find and follow all of our content. And then if you're looking at the show description, you'll see links to any resources that were referenced in the show, as well as the sponsors for this episode. Please do check those out. We are very grateful for a variety of different institutions in helping to make this show possible. Until next time, seek the good enjoy the true, and live the beautiful.